the energy. Try to keep the eyes open. I'm sure hopefully this conversation will be stimulating and engaging. So we're going to have an interesting time. This is one of two sessions that is going to really be under the general rubric of freedom of religion and belief. Obviously there are plenty of other topics of great significance that are being discussed, but this is going to be one where we're going to have that as something of the focus. And this particular session is really going to be considering, and I have an esteemed group of people who are going to be talking, is going to really be looking at the power of freedom of religion and belief to really bring communities together and to make sure that the voice of faith communities continues to be heard, particularly in a world that is becoming, particularly in the Western world perhaps would be the right way of putting that, is becoming increasingly secular. And on the one hand, secular is a good thing, but the problem, maybe the challenge that is increasingly seen is that secularism, instead of just bringing a level playing field, starts to push the voice, the views, the opinions, and the values of faith communities to the outskirts of the conversation. And I think because we are here in a very much, I would say, one of the most significant interfaith gatherings, it is very important that we actually have the voice of the faith communities heard, and to maybe get some illustrations as to how this is working in the societies in which we live, and the very real benefits. Because of course, what we're discovering is that we find for all faith communities, we can find in freedom of religion and belief a common cause. We all believe and agree that we should be able to pass our faith and our views and our values on to our children. We all believe and agree that we should be allowed to express our faith freely without fear and without sanction. So we are going to also explore then, if we do, which we do, start to collaborate together, start to engage together, then in the process of which you find that faith groupings that maybe would never normally under different circumstances have too much in common with each other from a theological point of view or spiritual point of view, actually do find that they have a lot in common. And the relationships and the relationship building that takes place and all the positive benefits of that, including, and I think very importantly, the peace building capacity that comes on the back of that as well, is really significant. So you're not going to hear much more from me. I'm going to start to introduce my wonderful panelists, and we're going to begin with Professor Hannah Smith from Brigham Young University, who's also going to give us some opening remarks, and then we're going to go down the rows.
Thank you so much, Michael. I don't think this is on. Okay. All right, perfect. Okay, we've got 2 mics working now, so here you go. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Michael, for that great introduction. I've been asked to start our conversation off today by talking a little bit about the international legal foundations for freedom of religion or belief, some of the frameworks that underpin this right, as well as its relationship to democratic values. And I'd like to actually start with the framing of the issues that we're going to talk about this afternoon by looking at some of the social science research that points to the value of religious freedom in bolstering democratic values, and then turn to those international instruments that protect these rights in various fora. So first, the social science research. There has been a growing body of very significant social science research that has been done by some of our colleagues that points to freedom of religion or belief as part of a bundled commodity of human freedoms that are associated with many positive outcomes in communities and societies around the world. And I'm going to be looking at some of the research that's been done by our colleagues Brian Grimm and Roger Fink and some other institutions that have really focused on how religious freedom is associated with a higher overall human development as measured by the Human Development Index published by the United Nations Development Program. So some of this social science research makes clear that there's a very strong correlation between a high degree of religious freedom in a society and other social goods, including civil and political liberty, press freedom, and economic freedom. The Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom also found that when there is a high degree of religious freedom in a country, there are also fewer incidents of armed conflict, better health outcomes, higher levels of earned income, prolonged democracy, and better educational opportunities for women. So you may be asking, well, if there's a correlation, is there really any causation? And again, there's some pretty good growing body of research that supports the proposition that there is, in fact, a causal link between these two situations. So, and part of this is called what is known as the religious freedom cycle. And the religious freedom cycle basically says that where there's religious competition inherent in religious freedom, that results in increased religious participation. Increased religious participation can in turn lead to a wide variety of positive social and political outcomes. And then as religious groups make these contributions to society and become accepted, religious freedom is then consolidated and the cycle continues. So competition in religion leads to increased religious participation, which leads to positive contributions of religion to society, which then reinforces religious freedom. So that all sounds wonderful, right, in theory, and I think in practice it's actually pretty solid that there is that correlation and causation. Unfortunately, according to the most recent Pew Forum study, religious freedom restrictions are high or very high in 37% of the world's countries, and 75% of the world's people live in those countries. So there's concern about another cycle, which is called the religious violence cycle. And again, Brian Grimm and Roger Fink talk about this in their work, that essentially describes attempts by social entities to restrict religious competition, then resulting in more violence and conflict, not less. So that cycle sort of starts with social restrictions imposed, lead to government restrictions imposed, and the two act in tandem to increase the overall level of violence related to religion. So how do we deal with these sort of recognized cycles? One very positive about where freedom of religion is flourishing. You get more competition, more religious participation, more societal goods from religion overall. The other, where government restrictions and social restrictions increase, you have more religious violence and less positive contributions in society. While there's obviously several very important international legal protections that foster expansive protections for freedom of religion or belief, and I know my time is up, so I'll just mention these very briefly. The Article 18 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, passed in 1966, also known as the ICCPR. Article 9 of the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms in 1950. Those two are really at the core of the international instruments that protect religious freedom. They're very similar. I won't go through a comparison right now due to time, but they're very similar in their protections and very robust in what they protect. They apply to everyone having the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. They have the right to change their religion. They have the right to manifest their religion individually and in community with others, in public and in private. And that people should not be subject to coercion with respect to their religion. Of course, there are limitations, and that's usually where the rubber hits the road. And again, I'll mention, since Michael referred to restrictions on parental rights involving religious freedom, Article 18 in the ICCPR specifically protects the respect for liberty of parents and parental religious freedom in the religious and moral education of their children. These two articles, 18 and 9, have very different enforcement mechanisms, and I'll end there. The enforcement mechanism for Article 18 is the UN Human Rights Committee, which monitors the implementation in the signatory countries. Article 9, of course, of the ECHR is enforced through the European Court of Human Rights. So very different sort of enforcement mechanisms, very different results because of those differences in enforcement. But that's sort of the legal framework and some of the social science research that I think really is important to set the table for why freedom of religion or belief is so important on the international stage.
Please do carry on. Just to introduce you, this is Juan Navarro Floria, and please make your contribution.
Thank you very much. Only to complete your statement, the Article 12 of the American Convention of of Human Rights also guarantees the religious freedom in terms very similar to the International Covenant. And we have an instrument which is the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, who has ruled in the last years something about this, but this is another thing. But my contribution was, I was thinking about something that maybe is useful, is look for the past of my country. I coming from Argentina. Because the Argentine National Constitution dates back to 1853. At that time, the country had a vast territory. Argentina is the 8th largest country in the world that was practically unpopulated, with just over 1 million inhabitants. The founding fathers set out to populate the country. And that's why the Constitution contains a unique and original invitation. It calls, I quote, "all men of the world who wish to inhabit Argentine soil," end of the quote, and mandates the promotion of immigration. The key to achieving this goal was guaranteeing all inhabitants, and especially foreigners, the fullest freedom of worship. The Argentine Constitution was the first in Latin America to guarantee religious freedom. That was the key to a massive migratory movement in the following decades. There were times when Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina, had more foreign inhabitants than Argentines. I myself and most of today's Argentines are descended from those immigrants. Many of them emigrated to Argentina because they were persecuted for their religion in their places of origin. Christians in the Middle East, Jews in Eastern Europe, and other religious minorities. In 60 years, the population of the country multiplied 8-fold, but at the same time, the per capita gross domestic product tripled. I repeat, the population multiplied 8-fold, and at the same time, per capita income tripled. Each of the country's inhabitants, both former and new, was 3 times richer at the end of the period. Incidentally, this serves as a reminder that immigration is not a problem, but a blessing. It's good to note this today. I come back to history. When we can ask ourselves a question, was religious freedom the only cause of Argentina's extraordinary growth between the late 19th century and the early 20th century? Certainly not. But it was undoubtedly crucial in encouraging migration. And once these migrants arrived with their very different religions, the religious freedom they enjoyed allowed their children to prosper without any religious restrictions. My conclusion is, it's no coincidence that the societies that have prospered most economically are those with a high degree of religious freedom, as we heard recently. The policy of broad religious freedom has left its mark on Argentina's society. Interfaith coexistence in my country is exemplary. There is true friendship and fraternity between people of different religious denominations. So, when many years after the period I just recalled, the country experienced, for various reasons, a serious economic and therefore also social crisis, it was the collaborative work of religious denominations that was able to ensure social peace. In 2001, when a severe economic crisis caused the collapse of the national government, it was the Catholic Church, along with other religious denominations, that called for a national dialogue that enabled the crisis to be overcome. This was the one fruit of decades of religious freedom. What happens at the national level also occurs in the microeconomy, but this is another story. On the other hand, as we are hearing and experiencing these days here, religions are powerful allies of states in achieving many of the development goals. Moreover, it's not difficult to notice that many of the SDGs, at least indirectly, have a religious inspiration. Consider, for example, the motto, "Leave no one behind." Any Christian can easily recognize this motto, an echo of the gospel parable of the lost sheep and the shepherd that leaves the others to go a place on his shoulders. Okay, I have no more time, so I finish here. I have another thing. Maybe we can. Okay.
You can try and pick it up in the question time, perhaps.
Okay.
But I think what you're making and what we've basically been establishing here is how critical it is and what a vital role faith plays in the fabric of any society's growth and development and cohesion. And obviously, one of the most important things about that is that it actually is an enabler, but it's also a protector. And so those twin things need to run together. And I think that's why it's so important, as we see in the world that we live in today, when you start to see religious freedom actually being eroded, and when you start to see it being diminished, that is actually a canary in the coal mine, in a sense, because at the heart of religious freedom is, of course, all the democratic rights that actually make our societies the free and liberating and prosperous ones that exist. Conscience, thought, belief, opinion, association, assembly, speech, all these things are fundamental. And when you see religious freedom coming under attack, often it's the softer target, then that's a big warning sign and maybe a red light. So maybe you could just pick up the conversation, sir. Let me introduce you. I'm so sorry. This is Elder Adilson de Paula Parrella, and he is from the Latter-day Saints, and I think you are based in Abu Dhabi.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Maybe what I want to bring is a different perspective, because being from Brazil, and just like Argentina, we enjoyed freedom of religion significantly. Then we moved to Abu Dhabi, where we enjoy the coexistence, freedom coexistence there, and tolerance. So the different perspective I would like to bring is, regardless of whether we live in a country with freedom, complete freedom of religion, or where we have tolerance and coexistence, maybe we should focus on the responsibility and duty that we have as religious institutions. Because if we wait until freedom of religion or coexistence is under attack, that's too late for us. So what I propose is that regardless of where we are, we should be engaged in the country that I would call the host country where we are. And we should be involved in the, as it's been discussed, humanitarian, emergency aid, and projects that will help people become self-reliant. We need to be involved in the community. We need to promote the well-being of the community. Something that else we can do is to be involved with what the community values and the government values. I'll give you an example. In the UAE, they value the family and strengthening the family and the new generations. They have a ministry there of the family. I've never heard of something like that before. So what can we do as a religious institution? We can support them locally. And lastly, we need to respect their traditions, their culture, and their beliefs. I believe that when we do that intensively, we build that relationship of trust. And when eventually pressures may come on either religious freedom or religious coexistence or religious tolerance, they will drive back to the experience that they have with us, and they will say, well, maybe we got to think twice before we threaten those freedoms or coexistence or tolerance. So it is a different perspective, but my experience in the Middle East has shown that they are extremely receptive, open, flexible, kind, and ready to work with us. But we have to engage, because if we just come and we close ourselves within our own communities, then we're going to be strangers to them. And that's not going to do us or them any good. So that's the different perspective.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm now going to introduce you Pastor Bert Pretorius. Pastor Bert leads one of the largest Christian organizations that represent somewhere in the region of 5 million people of the Christian faith. And he is very much involved at the coalface and involved in the societal developments, in the governmental discussions and structures. So, Pastor Bert, thank you for your contribution.
Thank you very much. So my perspective is more from a pastoral point of view, and I'm a on-the-grounds pastor, so I'm in the thick of things. But I also head up SACOFF, which represents just close to 20,000 churches. And coming to freedom of religion, I think it's important to understand the role that FBOs play within the nation. And, things like, the intelligence that we carry because we're within the communities, intelligence as far as social, economic, safety. As churches and as religious communities, we're mission-driven. We're not profit-driven, so the mindset is different, which means we're not going anywhere. Our presence is permanent. So whether there's money or whether there's no money, we're not going anywhere. So I'm talking from grassroots, the mindset. And thus, religious freedom is the pillar of a stable social society, and that's why, from where I am as a leader, fighting that fight. And in South Africa, it's a lot more prevention. We have considerable freedom, and also where we stand together, because what affects I'm a Christian, but what affects a Christian affects the Muslim community, affects the Jewish community, affects the traditional African community. So it's a place where we need to stand together, and and make sure that we have the right and the next generation, the children after that, because it's so easy to lose those freedoms. And we have seen that the bills being changed, and amended and adapted. Before was put through, some were put through, and we fought it afterwards. But I think it's so critical that we have the freedom to be able to. And then, of course, as a pastor, as a pastor, of course, being a Christian, part of the Christian faith is the ability to preach the gospel. So for us, freedom of religion is to be able to preach the gospel so people can hear. So that's with countries where you're not allowed to, what they call it, proselyting. So I think we fall under that category. But so just before I do an altar call, I'm teasing. So in that sense, for us, that's the freedom. That you're able, of course, within the parameters of not coercion, as you said. It's important. But part of Christianity is preaching the gospel. So if you're not allowed to do that, you're not like a Christian. You understand? So part of that being able to share the good news, and if we're not allowed to do that, it infringes on our rights hectically. Thank you.
I think you raised a very important point, and that is that every faith wants to be able to express their belief and to pass on their faith and to reach other people with their beliefs. And one of the things that we've seen, which has been, I think, very effective, is because obviously faith communities are made up of people, of citizens of the nation. And of course, when citizens of different faith groupings realize that their potential right to do what they want to do in the expression of their faith is likely to be curtailed, then we have a common cause. And of course, politics is a numbers game. And one of the things that we've been able to do is to identify, as you say, we don't attribute bad intention to government, but sometimes the way things are drafted potentially means that if they're passed in that way, they could be weaponized. And sadly, sometimes laws are weaponized against people of faith. That's just the reality of it. And so we do what we can to, from my organization's side, look at everything that comes through Parliament, look at every regulation, every law, look at the court cases, because obviously freedom of religion is a common right to all faiths, and what affects one adversely is going to affect others adversely. And then we find that we can then look at what the law actually says, and then we can present, hopefully, solutions. In other words, if there's a bad piece of drafting, then we will propose a better piece of drafting to fix some of the problems. And then we can also lobby politicians, and we can lobby within parliaments. And of course, the faith communities have the ability, which is why sometimes maybe governments see them as slightly threatening. They can send a narrative right down to grassroots level very quickly that may be not the same narrative the government wishes them to be expressing. And of course, one of the critical components of the faith communities is that they are the moral voice. They do speak truth to power. They can actually have that very critical influence. And so that is why we find common cause. And when we can mobilize and we can get some of the numbers of people to say to government, actually, no, we don't want this, but rather that, then your influence, even in the policy making, the lawmaking processes, really start to come into effect. And I want to hand over to Moulana Ali, if I can. And please just give us some of your perspectives, because you've very much been involved in the interfaith communities in South Africa and in a lot of these issues as well. So we'd love to hear.
Thank you. Yeah. So I've drafted a document, but obviously the time is not going to allow. Suffice to say that I represent the United Ulama Council of South Africa that was formed in 1994. And it serves the broader fraternity of ulama, religious institutions across the country. And so our constitution gives us the freedom of religion and affords us to practice our religion. In South Africa, the Muslim community has been here since 1652. And we have been part of the struggles that the South African indigenous community faced. And we have all overcome that by standing together, dismantling the apartheid system, and including the Muslim community. And so the formation of the constitution is a makeup of all people in this particular country. And so there's a bill there, the Bill of Rights, that speaks to the rights of religion, of people, and so forth. And in our preservation of our religion, we have firmly upheld those particular faith principles, the likes of the issue of homosexuality. Now, I should just quote this. Islamic law prohibits homosexuality, homosexual conduct. It does not prohibit homosexual thoughts or feelings. And so the Islamic theology holds further that the Muslim who denies this law in Islam has by operation of law apostatized from Islam. It is a very firm faith in with references to the issue of gender. Now, the South African government has instituted an act that is known as the Hate Crimes Act, Hate Speech Act. Obviously, it has moved from the Hate Speech to Hate Crime Act. And the object of this particular act are to give effects to the Republic's obligations regarding prejudice and intolerance as contemplated in international instruments. In the preamble of the international instrument referred to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention, its preamble states that the Convention is based on the principles of the dignity and equality of inherent in all human beings. It commits itself to achievement of one of the purpose of the United Nations, which is to promote and encourage universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, and religion. So, the Hate Crimes Act causes confusion because it does not clearly define what hate or harms are, and it is rather left very open for interpretation. And in actual fact, the law that passes here, if a person violates this particular Hate Crimes Act, is very, very severe. And so, when we speak about coalition, we have formed a coalition, and we are very grateful. Michael is part of that. Our Pastor Bert is part of it. Our sister is here, part of it, Moulana. And we have formed this particular coalition based on the principle of commonality. That how can we stand together, speak to religious freedom, uphold religious values, and at the same time be able to address these particular issues with the government. And currently we are dealing with the issue of the early childhood toolkit, which the government or the basic education institution is pushing down the throat of faith communities, where the issue of gender has to be embraced. And so we are standing together opposing this particular act by the government. And so there's a lot of work to do, but in our collectiveness, in freedom of religion, and working together as a coalition, I believe there's much more that we can be able to achieve and accomplish. Thank you.
Thank you, Moulana Ali. Well, I think we must go to you now, Sister Hedwig. You are, please maybe just introduce yourself and where you come from, give us some context, and then please make your remarks.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you, the audience, for giving me this time. I'm Sister Hedwig Muse. I work for the Association of Sisterhoods of Kenya, a religious group of Catholic sisters serving in Kenya. So that's where I stay and work. And hearing about freedom of religion, as our professors have clearly really elaborated on the frameworks, it really speaks to human dignity and human rights, which is a framework that they have clearly explained. And to me, as a person, hearing freedom of religion, as I always share, speaks to my own experience growing up as a young girl in an African family with the diversity of religion, and becoming a nun was not well understood with many of my family who do not subscribe to my faith and who felt that they expected some dowry and so forth. So that sinks well with me. And moving on to the big faith community of the Catholic religious women where I work and serve, we respond to the needs of the people in the community across the country and beyond through the various programs that we have. Obviously, like any other faith group, we do education, social support, social services, health, and so forth across the country, in camps, in rural, urban, and so forth. And our support to the people is to help them live their faith, but not to win them over, because we respect and appreciate the diversity that comes with that. So we serve communities of diversity in terms of religious background, cultural backgrounds across the country, and helping them to live their faith well through access to basic support that we, as a faith group of the women religious in Kenya, are able to give. Just giving an example, we have schools, like if you go at the coast of Kenya, there is a Star of the Sea. It's a Catholic, strong-founded school. But when you go there at first glance, you think it's a Muslim school. Why? Because majority of our students are Muslims. And they are free to wear the hijabs, to keep their identity. Because our role is to support them, appreciate the values, and live their faith as required. Because At the end of the day, we also appreciate the fact that we share into various values as faith groups. Now, moving on out of our association to other networks of the faith groups, we have a very vibrant association or movement of interreligious dialogue in Kenya, where we, the faith group of the Catholic sisters, are very, very active in this organization. And what is our main focus is steering, enhancing good governance, social justice, human rights, and so forth, that we really bring the beauty of diversity of all religious affiliations together and try to see how best can this government be run. We are not opposition, but we are just playing the key role of the faith groups that we are all emphasizing, that we cannot leave the government to be so secularized and sit back. We need to keep them in check and ensure that they work and act in the interest of the people that put them in place. So that's what we do, and we've been able to, you realize recently it was on media, it's not a secret, when our president in Kenya was talking about putting up a church in State House. I don't know how many of you heard of that. And we, as the faith groups, we are coming together asking, our country, our constitution does not have a state religion. So if we do that, is he going to build the temple for the Muslims? I mean, the mosque for the Muslims, the temple for the Jewish, for the Hebrew, for everyone to be represented in the State House. So we came together and started thinking about how can we challenge this as a faith group. We also heard about the 7/7, the demonstrations of the Gen Zs in Kenya. So prior to that, through the interreligious dialogue, we came together in our diversity of our religions and thinking loud, how can we talk to the government to be able to listen to the grievance of the young people without arresting them, without subjecting them to violence, and be able to guide them. And we told ourselves, the different religious faith groups, come 7th July, let's open our mosques, let's open our temples, let's open our churches to allow the young people to come in. Let's listen to them, help them, and guide them on how best they can express their grievance. So for us, as the Association of Sisterhoods of Kenya, we believe in collaboration and networking, getting diversity, ideas, and moving together. And as I finish, my parting shot will be, we need to enhance this collaboration and networking and probably put measures in place at faith groups. How best can we enhance our collaboration in terms of ensuring good governance, social justice, human rights, through monitoring process, and holding each other accountable besides the government? Where are we also as our faith groups, so that we check on ourselves and be able to work in collaboration to ensure that really the freedom of religion is enjoyed and is felt not only in theory, but also in practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Wonderful. Yeah, I've been sitting here thinking, one of the things that is so important about religious freedom is that it very much undergirds the diversity, particularly in South African society. We have an extremely diverse society in South Africa. We are culturally diverse. We are faith diverse. And of course, we also have to understand that what protects one person's faith protects everybody's faith. There was a very interesting case that the Constitutional Court heard of a young Hindu girl, and it was known as the Paula case. And she had gone through a coming-of-age ceremony, and the coming-of-age ceremony involved a little stud through her nose as a symbol that she had actually reached that particular stage of womanhood or development within her faith. And she went back to school, and the school said, we have a no jewelry policy. You must take that stud out of your nose. And she argued, I suppose her parents argued, that this is actually very much a part of her faith. It's an expression of her faith. And the Constitutional Court ruled in her favor. And they said that you must actually reasonably accommodate. And that's a very important principle. You must reasonably accommodate faith in all aspects of society. You can't just say no if this is something that is essential, because they recognize that is such an important element of your human dignity. It's an important element of the fabric of the society itself. And of course, the flip side of that is that had they said, yes, you must take it out, then that same ruling, and that's why it's so important with religious freedom to understand that what affects one affects all, that would have equally applied. So somebody who was maybe wearing a cross as a symbol of their faith could be told, take that cross off, or a promise ring, take that off, or even, and we had a very important situation in the Islamic faith where an army major was wearing a head covering under her beret, and they said no, she wasn't allowed to. But ultimately, the decision that the Constitutional Court had taken meant that actually that had to be reasonably accommodated. So freedom of religion is a very powerful glue that actually holds our society together and holds the common values that we share together and allows us to live with the diversity that actually makes up a vibrant society. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Ma'am Thembi Tulwana, and maybe you could also just briefly introduce you and who you are and how it works.
Thank you, Michael. My name is Thembi Tulwana. I come from Inkululeko Yesizwe Association. I'm the Secretary General there. However, Inkululeko Yesizwe Association was formed by Imboni, Dr. Uzilweze Khadebe, and Inkululeko Yesizwe Association now commands membership of over 10 million people. And we are all led by knowing our spirituality. Just to kick off, I need to indicate that the working together of all religious, any other faith group, and spirituality has actually worked to our favor as the peoples of South Africa, specifically because our constitution allows us to do that, specifically because people of different faiths and spirituality serve one creator. And they need to uphold peace, they need to uphold collaboration, and they need to ensure that the people of South Africa develop according to the script of the creator. And right now, as my colleagues from the coalition indicated, we are looking at a situation where the Department of Basic Education has piloted an early childhood education kit, exposing young learners to transgender topics and the idea that children may choose their preferred gender. And this goes against the grain of freedom of religion, freedom of practice, and freedom of expression. However, the Department of Education forgot that they are presenting all these interesting topics to young people who are unsuspecting and very vulnerable. This therefore raises urgent concerns regarding developmental appropriateness, parental rights, and the spiritual principles which underpin human identity in African indigenous spirituality. We all know, as people who practice African indigenous spirituality from the Revelation Spiritual Home, that African spirituality identifies and teaches the identity of people, the balance of their spirituality, including the laws that govern us in South Africa. We need to be able to assert the two inherent biological genders and corresponding energies. Our report, as the Revelation Spiritual Home, examines the initiatives that the Department of Basic Education, through the lens of African indigenous spirituality and the South African framework, offering a spiritually grounded, rights-informed response. Our approach, therefore, looks at children's developmental capacities. We all know that young children, particularly pre-primary learners, lack the cognitive and spiritual maturity to engage meaningfully with complex gender identity concepts. It is, of course, through parental authority in spiritual identity that these ideas should be formed. In African indigenous spirituality, we position parents as primary spiritual educators. And of course, I'm indicating or talking a lot about spiritual educators because we believe that each and every human being is spiritual. So in our context, we're saying we do not want that to be taken away by any other body within the South African government or any other department, thereby removing the teachings and the interests of parents from their children. We stand by the rule that early introduction of any concept without parents' involvement undermines this role, and that is the role of parental authority and spiritual identity formation. To that end, we also look at the children's rights under the South African law. Unfortunately, our Constitution in Section 28 mandates that the best interests of the child are paramount. And this is from the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. However, it actually puts us in an unenviable situation where the Department of Basic Education will actually promote that our children are exposed to concepts that they can hardly interpret or even act on. But most importantly, it is going to affect their childhood. They're not given the chance to make their own decisions at the right time. In addition, the Children's Act further stresses parental involvement in decisions affecting our minors. What is our perspective in African indigenous spirituality in this regard? African indigenous spirituality is structured upon spiritual principles that are guiding functionality and spiritual laws that ensure order and discipline. So if those two are dictated upon, we just wonder and shudder as well to think what's going to happen to our children who are quite vulnerable now, and this whole notion of gender proposals is going to confuse them to no limit. So we are saying within African indigenous spirituality that two biological genders exist. And we want to specify that we are not arguing about other genders that exist as well, but we are looking at what our spirituality, our religions and faiths indicate. And we're talking about these two genders that exist, that is male and female, each with their respective spiritual energies and authority. And it brings us to a subject of spiritual duality, which is essential for universal balance, while African indigenous spirituality respects individual gender, individual gender identification. It also maintains the dual gender structures, is spiritual and needs to be attended to. Detaching gender education from spiritual context disrupts societal harmony and invites disorder. Interventions like sex education, focusing on condom use, have in some cases increased sexual activity among young learners, highlighting the absence of African indigenous spiritual guidance in existence. The evidence and reasoning from our part, we're saying teenage pregnancy and sexual behavior is actually promoted in what is being brought together as a world phenomenon where our children have to be taught all sorts of subjects not them being able to comprehend what is being spoken about. We look at comprehensive sexual education. Evidence from South Africa shows that in schools, adolescent girls exposed to comprehensive sexual education have lower odds of being HIV positive. However, what is important is us bringing up children who are going to be able to make the best decisions for themselves. However, at this very tender age, they need to be guided by their parents. They need to be guided by whoever is their guardian at that time, but not to be forced to follow these teachings from the Department of Basic Education. So our recommendations are that the policy needs to be aligned and delay gender orientation contact. We require parental informed consent in order for our children to agree and accept that at a particular time in their lives, they need to be guided by their parents and also be advised accordingly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hannah.
All right, I think we're going to open it up for Q&A if anyone has any questions from the audience. We're going to take probably 2 or 3 at a time, and then we'll allow the speakers to respond to whichever question they would like to respond to. So we'll start here. Go ahead.
Regarding data on social hostilities indicate that a lot of times social hostilities are sourced in religion on religion within a culture. Can you comment on faith-based responsibility to, in addition to talking about affirming your own right to have particular gender perspectives, do those faith traditions also have a responsibility to teach respect and human rights for those that do practice that which you disagree with?
All right, is there another question that we'll take at the same time? Yes, over here, Mark Hill.
I'm just particularly interested in this stock-taking exercise of drawing together the G20 agenda and religious freedom. And I was thinking back to the plenary this morning when so much emphasis was placed on sustainable development goals, which lie at the heart of the G20 agenda. And one of those, I think it's goal number 8, is about decent work. And I think one place where religious freedom is so important is within the workplace and ensuring freedom of religion where one works, whether it's in private industry or in the public sector. And I think, Michael, you've covered this when talking about how one finds reasonable accommodation. It's far more extensive, even than the examples you gave. It pervades every aspect of the working life. And I think, Hannah, you similarly drew attention to Brian Grimm's work, which is suggestive that where one has within the working environment a high level of freedom of religion, then productivity increases, job satisfaction increases. And I was delighted at an A-class meeting earlier in this year from Nigeria, there was strong data which said that these things are absolutely true. High levels of religious freedom create far more satisfaction at work, and that's just an example of how the G20 agenda can correlate with the religious freedom agenda. So thank you for what you've shared.
And you'll get to hear more of Mark tomorrow because he speaks on the second religious freedom panel. Is there a third question we can take? Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, I want to thank all the panelists for your wisdom and for the leadership that you're taking within your communities. And I want to add to what the gentleman started to say, that within the religious freedom, I think it is very important, as you said, that we're keeping that freedom. For the simple reason is that when someone practices freedom to religion and the religion itself, it's not only the philosophical, like Pastor Bert saying, that you need to preach the gospel. Within the gospel and within the teaching, that Islam, Jewish faith, Christianity, or whatever, there is practices. And those practices, when we are in a society, it makes us sit within the boundaries. And the boundaries, such as a child, when you give him the boundaries, he's a happier child. So when you're having those boundaries, coming to the Sustainable Development Goals, is that we want to achieve something within greater of what we have right now, but we need to learn those practices. And those practices coming, normally, at least for my community, from the faith-based leaders, from my rabbi, or from the pastors, reverends, imams, sheikhs. They're preaching not only their faith, but also the boundaries within the practices of their faith. So I think religious freedom is extremely, extremely important for a positive, growing society. And my question to the panelists and to the leaders in the room is, how can we uphold that constitution per regional law, that it's not going to be abusive, but it will be within a framework that allow a religious leader to continue practice his faith and being a leader, religious freedom, as we're speaking over here, but not compromising on those values. I hope that makes sense. Yes.
Okay, who'd like to start?
Can I take the
Yes.
first question? And the first question is, what can we do to teach our people the right principles at the same time loving others? And the principle God and Jesus Christ have taught themselves. We love God above all things, and we love our neighbor as ourselves. So those are the principles. Now, everything that we are discussing institutionally starts at home, with we as parents teaching and setting the example to our children. So it boils down to, we teach correct principles, they govern themselves, but we set the example of how we treat others, and we live with respect, and how we love others. Does that make sense? We love God, we love our neighbor, regardless of who our neighbor is, or what they believe in, or what they don't believe at all.
If I could also just maybe bring us back to where we began. We were speaking about one of the challenges is, of course, secularism is very much the pervading philosophy, if you like, even a political philosophy. And that, on the one hand, is very good because it does bring different balances, different perspectives. But one of the biggest dangers, of course, is when you find the state, or if the state, and this is really a foundational principle of religious freedom, because it comes out of literally centuries of conflict, that whenever a state has put its political power behind any faith or any ideology, it always ends badly for someone. And that is, I think, one of the things which is concerning about the imposition, perhaps, of what we might call secular viewpoints on the faith communities. It's not that the faith communities are intolerant or anti anything particularly, but what they don't want is they don't necessarily want those views and their values to be forced with state backing onto their own children. And unfortunately, the sort of paintbrush effect is sometimes that, well, you know, they're going to grow up those children to be intolerant of people who are different from them. But that actually takes away, I think, a lot of agency from parents, because parents don't typically teach their children to just, you know, be nasty to people. In fact, most parents teach their children, because it's just good parenting values, to respect other people, to recognize other people for who they are. So it's not a negative anti-thing. But of course, when, as a parent, you find that somebody, particularly a state-backed entity, is contradicting the views and values that you would like to teach your children, that becomes problematic. And it's problematic at a really quite a deep societal level, because of course then parents tend to withdraw their children.
Bert had to reinstate that opt-out option for these parents. So really timely decision on an issue that I think is going to be litigated in a lot of different countries. And fortunately for the parents of many different religious communities in Maryland, they were able to get that opt-out back and be able to guide the education of their children.
Thank you very much. The 2 points or 3. First of all, I fully agree with Mark with his remarks, and one of the things that I had to say before is what Brian Greene said about the importance of religious freedom in the workplace. So I fully agree with you, and of course with your statement about I know the sentence of the court. But I spoke about the Constitution of my country, and many of us spoke about the Constitution and the law. I'm a lawyer, and I believe in the force, in the importance of the law for, in this case, for the guaranteed religious freedom. But it's not enough. The law and the constitutions are very important. Many of us used to work with the lawyer, with the lawmakers, but this is not enough. The key issue is education, but not only the education of the childhood, of course, is the beginning, but the education of all the people. And this is a responsibility of religious bodies, of the churches, of the communities, to educate their people in the freedom, in the religious freedom. And why? Because, as Sister Hedwig said, this is a question of human dignity. The reason because we defend freedom of religion is because we are defending the human dignity, which is the main basis of this. And there are another thing that is a practical reason that we can experience this here in this meeting, that how is it playing? I am Catholic. In my country, the Catholic Church is the majority, large majority. And so we can say, well, religious freedom is not a matter to us because we are the majority. But we can experience, looking for the world, that we are minorities in many places. The sister take his experience, and it's the same for any religion. There are some Muslim countries where the Muslims are the majority, but in my country, Muslims are a small group, and they deserve the full religious freedom, as we, the Christians, deserve the same freedom in the other countries, and each of our religions has the experience of to being a minority in some places. So it's a practical reason. But the fundamental reason is the dignity that we have to defend. And this is a duty of the religious bodies of the churches to educate their people in these principles. This is my opinion.
Pastor Bert, would you like the last word?
So the altar call. Look, I'm a leader of a Christian organization. Christians are nasty. Pastors can be nasty. I got to deal with that every single day. So you can't legislate that. So we can talk about law, freedom of law. It's got to do, starts with the home, starts with your relationship with God. And that is something we need to deal with. So it's something, tolerance, and accepting people where they're at, not necessarily agreeing, and that's where the problem comes, is when we don't have the right to disagree. So, but other than that, there's got to be tolerance, and there's got to be love. But we get some awful people that do awful things in the name of Christianity. But that's part of our job as leaders to work and sort that out. And some of it is done out of ignorance, some of it's done out of negligence, but you can't legislate the heart. You can legislate up to a certain point, but then it's a heart issue. And legislating, not never mind the heart, legislating the intent of a heart. So there's you can only take it up to a point, but then it's, I think, cultivating a responsibility amongst every single person, that we have a responsibility, and you mentioned it, that we need to love one another, and that means tolerating people. You might not agree, but you've got to understand that's where they're at. You understand in their life that's where they're at. So, but of course, with the freedom of religion for us comes in, is where you say that we don't have the right to disagree, and that's the issue.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing. I think you make a really good point that you may have freedom of religion or belief in the law, but whether or not you have it in your culture is a very different thing, right? And laws are there to be sort of guardrails to mark and demark where you can't go, what you can't do, and the bounds of appropriate action. But to develop a culture that actually manifests a robust religious pluralism and a robust understanding of the freedom of religion for everyone is a very different thing than setting guardrails that prohibit certain behavior. So that's why I think you see on the program for the G20 Interfaith Forum, you see on a lot of different conference programs, a lot of emphasis on religious literacy and cross-cultural understanding and really engaging our culture. Where are we in teaching our children to love and respect people who are different from us? That starts at a very, very young age, and that's just as important as legislating prohibitions and making sure that people are abiding by the law. It's just as important to cultivate that culture of the heart, which recognizes religious pluralism and religious tolerance.
So I think ladies first, but also ladies last. So we're going to conclude with Sister Hedwig.
Today, ladies last. Anyhow, allow me to make a little contribution on balancing religious freedom and values vis-a-vis legal frameworks that may seem to be a barrier to the same. I think that is when faith groups come in handy in terms of dialogue and advocacy with the duty bearers to be able to sit and talk and see how the religious freedom and values can be maintained. I give an example in Kenya. I think it was last year when the government came up with hiked rates or costs for work permits for the missionaries coming to work in the country. But through the intervention of the religious groups with the government, within a duration that was not so long, the government was able to think through and mitigate and reduce the costs that they had so much hiked and was proving a burden for most of the missionaries coming to work. So advocacy, dialogue can make a great improvement and a great understanding with the duty bearers, with different governments. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I think that concludes our session. Thank you so much for your attention. I trust that it has been helpful and interesting, and looking forward to seeing you tomorrow for another great day at this year's Life 20.
Thank you so much for the moderators and for you and for the panelists. Just reminding you that tomorrow we meet here again at what time? 9, okay? Downstairs. And then the program goes on, 9 a.m. Thank you.
Should we get a quick...
Do you want to take a picture of all of us on the panel?